Hello, this is Miss Elizabeth. Today we're reading part 6 of My Teacher is an Alien. Peter looked at me. I looked at him. I wondered if he was as terrified as he looked. I wondered if I looked as terrified as I felt. "What's he doing in here?" I whispered. "And what's happening to him?" hissed Peter. "And what are we going to do about it?" I thought. We hesitated for only a second, and then began to creep down the stairway. Duncan was still screaming. We had left the door to the attic open in case we needed to make a quick getaway. Poking my head around the edge, I looked in the direction of the screams. They were coming from the room where Mr. Smith sat to take off his mask every night. I reached for Peter's hand. "What should we do?" I asked. He pointed down the hall and started off with me following close behind. After a couple of steps, we dropped to our bellies and slid up to the door and peeped around the edge. I couldn't believe it. Duncan was all alone. He was standing in front of the mirror, screaming for all he was worth. I can't say that I blamed him. The communicator was on and Duncan was looking into the bridge of Broxholm's starship. And one of those hideous aliens from the ship was looking back at him, talking to him in that language of growls and shrieks. I took a deep breath and slithered into the room, crawling across the floor as fast as I could move. I scooted right under the table and hit the switch I had seen Broxholm use to turn the set off. It made a crackling noise and then fell silent. Duncan stopped screaming. "You idiot!" yelled Peter, jumping into the room. "What are you doing in here?" "I got bored," sniveled Duncan. Talk about a short attention span. He couldn't have been out there for more than 5 or 10 minutes. "And I wanted to see if you were telling the truth or not," he continued. "So I went around the house and came in through the cellar. This was the only room with anything in it, so I came in, and when I touched that switch, that thing showed up and started growling at me." Duncan was blubbering now, with big tears cutting paths down his dirty face. He turned to me and said, "Is that what Mr. Smith really looks like?" I nodded my head. Duncan's eyes rolled back in his head and he fainted. By the time we got him to his feet and out of the house, I only had 10 minutes to get back to school. "Maybe I shouldn't go back," I said. Peter shook his head. "You have to," he said. "We can't afford to be more suspicious than we already are. Anyway, I don't think the aliens actually saw you, at least not your face. You stayed down low enough." "Well, what about me?" blubbered Duncan. "Well, what about me?" Peter hesitated. "You'll have to hide out at my house," he said. "It's the last place anyone would look for you. If you stay there, you may be safe. Get going, Susan. You've got to get back to school as soon as possible. Don't worry about the pictures. I'll take care of that. Just move." I hopped on my bike and headed for school. By riding extra hard, I got there just about the time my lesson was supposed to be ending. But I was all hot and sweaty when I sneaked back in. Even worse, I ran into Mr. Bambrick the moment I walked through the door. He was furious. "Susan, where have you been?" he shouted. "I've spent the last 40 minutes waiting for you. We've got a concert in 2 days, and my star soloist can't even show up for her lesson." I did the only thing I could think of. I started to cry. It wasn't hard to do since I was on the edge of tears anyway. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bambrick," I sobbed. I just so frightened I couldn't come to my lesson. Wow. So far, so good. I was actually managing to tell him something that was pretty close to the truth. But then I felt bad because Mr. Bambrick, who really is a good guy, had got upset about scaring me and started apologizing for putting me under so much pressure. In the end, it worked out better than I could have imagined. Mr. Bambrick went to Mr. Smith and explained that there had been a problem with my lesson, and since we had this important concert coming up, would it be possible for him to keep me a little while longer, and so on. It was great. I had a real excuse, and I even got to work on my solo. Back in class, things were pretty quiet until just before the end of the day when Mike Foran started throwing spitballs at Stacy. I wondered if the two of them weren't actually enjoying themselves. After all, they had been so well behaved for the last several years that maybe this was the perfect chance for them to let off some steam. But it wasn't Stacy and Michael who were asked to stay after school that day. No, that horror was resolved for you, yours truly. I was sitting at my desk, thinking that maybe we'd actually gotten away with our little photo session when Mr. Smith walked up to me and said, "Ms. Simmons, I want you to stay after school. I need to talk to you." It was amazing how two simple sentences could teach me a whole new level of fear. The other kids had left. I was alone with the alien. At least Stacy had lingered at the door for a few minutes until Mr. Smith turned to her and said, "It's time for you to go, Miss Bennett. I want to speak to Miss Simmons in private." Stacy looked at me with an expression that said, "I tried." Then she hurried away. Broxham Smith walked over and straddled the chair in front of my desk. He leaned towards me and said, "I know what you did today." "Oh," was all I could manage. I felt as if someone had dropped an ice cube into my heart. The worst thing was I couldn't even be sure what he meant. Did he know I'd skipped my piccolo lesson? Or did he know I'd been inside his house? I looked at the door and wondered if I would ever go through that door as a living person again. "Well?" said Mr. Broxham. "I'm sorry," I whispered. It was about all my voice was good for at that point. It was also just as vague as his first statement. I wasn't about to say what I was sorry for. Broxham looked at me. "I don't understand why you dislike me so much, Susan," he said. "I'm just trying to do what is right for this class. Yet you've been hostile to me from the moment I walked through the door." Oh, what an actor! I wondered if he would ever be that good. I wondered if I would ever be that good. It was amazing how he was still pretending to be just a teacher who was having trouble with one of his students. Suddenly he rose and crossed the room and closed the door. "Now," he said, sitting down in front of me again, "let's be honest with each other, shall we, Miss Simmons?" Should I say something? Should I tell him I knew his secret? "Why are you here anyway?" I said at last, still playing his game of not saying anything that couldn't be taken at least two ways. "I'm here to learn," he said smoothly. "After all, isn't that what school is for?" Creep, I thought, but out loud I said, "I thought you were supposed to be the teacher." I tried to keep my voice from cracking, but it did anyway. Broxham shifted in his chair. "A good teacher is always learning," he said. "Education is a process of give and take. Look at all I've taken from this class already. I've taken a lot of nonsense. I've taken a lot of snottiness." Suddenly he turned and looked directly at me. "And I'll have to take a few more things in order to learn all I can. If you take my meaning, Miss Simmons." I shrank back in terror. I didn't know how he did it, but I could actually see his alien eyes beneath his mask, as if he were burning with a light of their own. "And I won't take kindly to any interference with my educational mission," he he said in a voice without any emotion. He had picked up a copy of Rockets and Flags, that dreaded book. Now he began to squeeze it. I watched his fingers sink right into the cover, compressing the paper with the power of his grip. I heard a horrible thumping sound. I glanced around to see where it was coming from. Then I realized it was the beating of my own heart. The universe is a very big place, Susan, said Broxholm gently. He dropped the book. His fingers had left dents half an inch deep in the cover. Oh, if only I could get the book out of here, I would finally have proof of what he was. But of course he had no intention of letting me have the book. He picked it up and carried it to his briefcase. A very big place indeed, he said, and there are more things going on in it than you can possibly imagine. It's important to learn all we can. Otherwise, terrible things can happen. Terrible things. That's my job, to prevent terrible things. Can you understand that, Ms. Simmons? I shook my head. Maybe I should have said I shook my head harder, since I was already shaking all over. He sighed. Well, perhaps someday you will, he said. For now, I simply want you to know that it is wisest and safest not to interfere with your elders. He closed his briefcase. I will see you tomorrow, Miss Simmons, he said. I trust that you will spend the entire day here in the classroom and not enter my home again. I almost fell off my chair. He knew. He had known all along. Before I could say anything, he went out the door, leaving me alone. It took me almost 20 minutes to get home. I cycled along the sidewalk slowly, watching every corner. I kept expecting to see aliens jump out of the bushes and grab me. When something did jump out of the bushes, I screamed so high and so loud, I surprised myself. And it was only Peter. Are you trying to give me a heart attack? I asked, straddling my bike and glaring at him. It would serve you right for bringing Duncan along today, he said. I wasn't up for a fight, and I said so. Peter was mad enough that he might have kept it going anyway, but when I started to tell him what had happened after school, he got so interested he forgot about being angry. He insisted that I try to remember every word that Broxholm had said. Where's Duncan? I asked when I finished my story. Hiding in my closet, said Peter with a wicked grin. We called his folks, and he's going to spend the next couple of days at my house. Didn't they ask any questions? Peter laughed. If you were Duncan's mother, wouldn't you be glad to have him out of the house for a while? I didn't think that was very nice, but I let it pass. Will you be able to stand him until all this is over? My problem is trying not to take advantage of him, Peter said sadly. It's not easy. I'd really love to get back at him for some of the things he's done to me. But he's so terrified I don't dare have any fun with him. I really think if I popped a bag near his ear, he'd have a heart attack and die. I laughed in spite of myself. What about your father? I asked. Peter grimaced. He won't even notice Duncan is there, he said. By the way, I took the pictures to the drugstore. We can pick them up after school tomorrow. If we live that long, I said. Relax, said Peter. Broxholm and his friends are here to collect people. I'd be really surprised if they'd actually kill anyone. That made me feel a little better. But it was only the thought that this whole mess might be over when we got the pictures that kept me from losing my mind that night. Even so, I was so frazzled I couldn't think about anything else. By morning, I was such a wreck that my special session with Mr. Bamwick was a total disaster. No, 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 he kept yelling. It's a B flat, Susan, B flat. Well, I can't get it right if you keep screaming at me, I said, trying not to cry. I couldn't blame poor Mr. Bamwick. The concert was only a day away, and I was getting worse by the minute. But I just couldn't concentrate on the music. How could I when I knew what else was supposed to happen? Could you play the piccolo if you knew some of your friends, or maybe even you, were about to be kidnapped by aliens? Aren't you worried? I asked Peter that afternoon on the playground. Not really, he said, his pale face split into a wide grin. I told you, I've got an alternative plan. Listen, Peter, I said, taking his arm, this isn't one of your science fiction books, and you're not Buck Rogers. Don't get carried away. He shook my hand away angrily. This is the greatest thing that's ever happened in this town, he said, and don't you forget it, Susan. At that point, Stacy and Mike were running by, yelling bad words at each other. We started to laugh. I heard Stacy say that her mother's going nuts, said Peter. I bet Mike's mom is too. I nodded. I felt almost sorry for them. It can't be easy to have a kid who's never been in trouble since kindergarten suddenly turn into a maniac. Of course, Stacy and Mike don't have much choice, I said. Sure they do, said Peter. What do you mean by that? I asked. But he wouldn't answer me. Just watch, he said. You'll figure it out soon enough. And we'll find out what Peter is up to in part 7 of My Teacher is an Alien.